It is not a new concept to avoid putting yourself in harm's way. Despite this, it is not uncommon for people involved in lifting operations to inadvertently put themselves in positions where, if something were to go wrong, they could be seriously injured. If something starts to go wrong during a lift, people often act instinctively and physically intervene in an attempt to resolve the issue, rather than stopping the lift from a place of safety. This short production outlines the principles of hands-off, step away, safe space, which is about lifting personnel assessing their surroundings, identifying the hazards that are present, and whenever reasonably practicable, taking their hands off the load and moving to a safe space before loads are lifted. We're going to be watching some typical lifting operations that you may encounter on a construction project and listening to an industry professional, Kevin Bennison, discussing the lifts with our presenter, Chris Simmons. They will be discussing how the lifting team carry out their role to ensure the safety of all personnel involved.
This is Kevin Bennison, and he is a lifting operations consultant who also works with Industry Lifting Lead AP Group. Now, Kev's going to explain the principles of HOSAS. Hands off, step away, safe space.
Sadly, there's been a lot of injuries in relation to people's interaction with loads, being in direct contact or close proximity to loads when they're being lifted. Many of those have been hand injuries, which are bad enough in themselves, but sadly there have been some fatal injuries as well of people being too close to the load.
So we're going to look at some of these examples being put into practice. So we're here and there's a lifting operations briefing taking place. Where would be the best place for the briefings to take place?
Well, that depends on the circumstances, but some of it would be worthwhile carrying the briefing out indoors, out of the weather, and you can get the full concentration of the team, and you can cover some of the theory elements of that, some of the principles of the lifting operation. But a lot of the briefing, it would be really helpful to carry that outside, actually near the point of works, because then you could point out the loads to be lifted, how they're to be slung, you could point out the equipment that's been used, and things such as where the load's going from and to.
And how can you make these briefings most effective, Kevin?
Well, it's called a briefing, so try to keep it brief. Stick to the really important points that people need to know, rather than getting into stuff that maybe they don't need to know about at that point in time. Make sure it's engaging, so things like getting eye contact with the people that you're giving the briefing to. If you want to give information on the slinging method, it's important to perhaps get the eye contact and the attention of, say, the slinger signaller when giving that information. It's really good to make sure that you're asking the group for their questions, their feedback, their suggestions. That helps keep the buy-in and constantly evolve and adapt to the situation.
Good communication in the briefing, listening, eye contact.
Keep it brief, stick to the main points, and ask for suggestions and confirm understanding.
Great information.
Briefings should be concise to ensure the key information in relation to the lift is communicated with clarity. The significant hazards that remain must be identified and the required control measures detailed. This will also start the process for the lifting team to consider where it will be safe to be positioned during the lift. All lifting personnel must be involved in the briefing. It is an opportunity to confirm that the lifting team understand what was briefed and for them to ask any questions they may have.
We're lifting a formwork shutter panel, so this gets used then for pouring concrete and shaping concrete. And really what the guys are looking at here is making sure that boom head stays as close as possible to directly above the position on the load, and that way they maintain control of the load. The risk we've got here, of course, is as that load is being picked up, it could move, and it's very difficult to ensure sometimes that you've got the jib head exactly in the right spot to avoid any movement of the load. So what the guys have done now is they've come a little bit clear, and at least if the load does move, then it's very unlikely to strike them. A lot of people feel that they have to be in close proximity to the load and sometimes even holding the load, whereas there are many situations that you don't really need to be in contact with the load, and it does give that little bit of safe space. They can clearly see what the load is doing in this case, they can direct the crane easily, but they're not so close that if the load moves, it's going to strike them.
Rotation of the load might be required as part of the lift. Where necessary, this is done with 2 cranes, but often it can be achieved with 1 crane only. Formwork is a good example of this, where the load is prepared horizontally but then stood up by one crane only. This rotation of the load can lead to unexpected load movement if not undertaken with care, or if the crane is not directed to move with the load to keep the hoist rope, lifting accessories and attachment points on the load vertically aligned. Loads which have a relatively high surface area and a relatively low weight, such as formwork, are also more likely to be affected by the wind. This may cause the load to rotate or sway as it catches the wind.
So I believe that we're lifting some Eki mats this time, Kevin, is that correct?
Yeah. And what they're going to be doing here now is they're going to be stacking the mats on top of each other. The real risk there is you've now got definitely a crush risk for fingers. So it's really important that they have their hands in a suitable position when they're landing the mats on top of each other to avoid any serious hand injuries of those mats coming down on fingers or fingers being trapped by the chain or whatever.
Yeah.
In a situation where the load was doing something that it didn't want it to do, it's just amazing that there's that instinct that sometimes kicks in for people to grab the load. I think being that kind of couple of metres away from the load, it just gives that time that rather than going back to put your hands on the load and grabbing the load if it's doing something you don't want it to do, you may stop the crane or just think of alternative action.
Simple loads which are moved routinely are often perceived to be low risk. Because of this, they are often moved at pace, which may catch out lifting personnel. If loads are close together and fairly light, there may be insufficient attention given to aligning the hook over the centre of gravity before each lift starts. Loads which were perceived to be low risk can therefore still present hazards from unexpected movement.
So we're now landing the concrete skip.
Yeah, it's going to get landed behind the concrete vehicle here just to get refilled, ready for the next pour. And he's going to use the marker here to help him with positioning the skip to get it in that right position, the ideal position for refilling it. This is a key point now where, as the skip's rolling over, you're not getting yourself in any bad position to end up being crushed or struck by that skip as it lays over. Watch the slinger signaller off to one side, clearly out the way of the skip, still directing the crane, got good clear view. So yeah, works well.
Yeah.
Really here, the main thing is trying to get the boom head directly above the position of the skip, you know, when it gets to that vertical point, so you can bring it up vertically with minimising the load swing. Well, there was a little bit of movement there, but that was nice. There's plenty of space, the slinger signaler's in a safe position, and that's the skip off, ready to go and get discharged into perhaps a formwork shutter.
Yeah.
Some loads are specifically designed to rotate when they are lifted or landed. If personnel are stood away from the load during this rotation, then it presents minimal risk to them. But conversely, if they are stood close to the load, they are at risk from the load striking them or from being crushed against any static objects. To assist in positioning loads such as these, it can be helpful to use positioning markers so that personnel can remain in a safe space away from the load.
So we're doing a trial lift here, is that right, Kevin?
He's taking the load up just to a reasonable height off the ground, just around about waist height. So it's at a position that you can check the load fully, but it's not too high, you know. I'd like to call it the 3 S's of trial lift, which is security, stability and slinging. You're checking that the load is completely secure and held by the accessories, the slinging arrangement. You're making sure it's stable, it's level, it's balanced, it's not going to come out of the slings. And you're also just having another check of the slinging to make sure things like slings aren't twisted, hooks are facing the way they're supposed to, shackles done up correctly, these kind of things. And of course you would want to check every load that you pick up. You do a trial lift on every lift just to make sure that's safe to send off.
A trial lift should be conducted for every load. Lifting personnel should be in a safe space away from the load before the trial lift starts. The trial lift should ideally be no more than waist height and will allow the lifting personnel to confirm 3 key things. Load security, that the load is free from debris and that the whole load is contained. Load stability, that the load is balanced and level. Slinging, that the accessories are correctly attached and being used at appropriate angles. If any issues are identified during the trial lift, the load must be returned to the ground and any necessary adjustments made before undertaking another trial lift.
One of the big things here then, Chris, is they've got to look at where they're ideally going to sling the load to get that to come up balanced. In this case, there's lots of rebar there, there's lots of different things around them, so that can be quite difficult. But it's thinking about where are we going with the load and how can I get myself in a position that if that load moves in an undesirable manner through load swing or wind or the boom head not being in the correct position, that actually I'm not going to be struck by it. Their hands are off, we can see there's no risk of their hands being trapped on any part of the load or on the chain there, which is good.
Yeah.
They have taken a step away and they're about to commence the lift. So let's see what happens here. You can see there, picked the load up, it's reasonably level, which is the one end maybe caught on something. Yeah, that's what it is. There was a bit of movement on the load there,
Yeah.
and you can see that where they were standing, they weren't in any danger,
Yeah.
which is a good thing.
Because they'd already stepped back.
The tagline is staying on the trailing end, so
Yeah.
the load is always moving away from the tagline handler,
Yeah.
and that's exactly what we want. We can see here as well, we'll see as the load comes up, but it's vital on getting that slinging position correct,
Yeah.
so that the balance of the load is suitable.
Is this a push and pull stick he's got there, Kev?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What he'd done there was he used that to actually retrieve the tagline,
Yeah.
so that he wasn't going beneath the load to get
Yeah.
the tagline, and pulled the tagline out towards him so then can hold the tagline. And good, he's using a push stick at the other end there just to stop the load from rotating and landing the load on these timbers. And we'll see, there are, with regards to some points you can put your hands and it's not going to be problematic.
Yeah.
But they didn't need to at all. That demonstrated there, in that case, there was just no need to put their hands on the load at all. Now, of course, in some situations, if it's necessary, you could hold the chain above the choke and make sure your hand isn't in any position that it could be snagged by the chain or anything like that.
Yeah.
But they didn't need to there. It was a great demonstration of actually not having to touch the load, which is exactly what we're trying to achieve. Looks like at the moment, there's the works manager, the supervisor and the slinger signaller in there. Who is it actually necessary to have within this restricted access zone at the moment?
You'd never go in if there was no reason to be there.
Yeah, well that's pretty good here because clearly, really, now that the works manager had pointed out which load had to be lifted, he wasn't really necessary for being in there.
And you've got to be confident, even if it's someone who's a senior rank, to ask them to leave.
Of course, yeah, we're all human beings, Chris, so it's easy to make a mistake no matter what level you're at.
Yeah.
It's about being mature enough to ask people, whoever they may be, to leave the area if they don't need to be in there, and also for the works manager to be mature enough to go, oh yeah, fair one, I'm not supposed to be in here.
Bundled loads are likely to settle into the slings as they are lifted. If personnel were to have their hands in or on a load when this happened, there is a high risk of crush injuries. Loads can also snag on obstructions, particularly if they lift up slightly out of level, and this can lead to the load moving unexpectedly, potentially springing up, as well as moving within the bundle. If a load gets snagged, there is the potential to damage or break either the lifting accessories or the attachment points on the load.
You happy with the taglines here, Kevin?
Yeah, so one of the guys there is going to reach out with the push-pull stick, grab the tagline, and then be able to take full control of the load. And of course, it depends on what the situation is to evaluate where the best place for the taglines is. If you've got two people on the taglines, it's actually best as it is where you've got the taglines on the same side of the load. That way, one can pull and just pull against the force of the other to make sure that nobody actually needs to go beneath the load. The main thing here is the direction the load's going. So it's going into potentially quite a confined area here. And it's about thinking about where is the person in relation to that load. The signaler's in a good position, and you can see where the crush zone is now potentially being created as that load approaches one of those fixed objects. And the guys are clear of that crush zone, which is good.
When lifting into or out of locations with limited space, always be aware of the potential for part of the load, any lifting accessories, or a tagline to snag on any obstructions or projections in the space. There is also the very real risk of inadvertently placing yourself in potential crush zones, created between the load and static objects as the load is moved. In locations such as deep excavations and shafts, there is also the possibility of the lift being blind, where the operator and slinger signaller do not have a direct line of sight of each other. In these cases, which can also happen when lifting behind or to the top of structures, there is the potential for unexpected load movement, either as a result of communication failure or misunderstanding.
Well, Kevin, it's been a fascinating day for me, you know, looking into your world. The clear message I'm hearing is the importance of communication, the three really important factors of HOSAS, and the importance of being brave enough to stop the crane.
The hands off, step away, safe space, just stop in the crane if there's something undesirable happening. Rather than looking at this as, oh, we're not going to have hands on the load. That's not what this is about. What this is about is really evaluating whether it's necessary to have hands on the load. Let's just make it so that hands are on the load through necessity rather than habit.
Great. Thanks, Kev. Be safe.
During the course of this film, we've seen some examples of typical scenarios you will encounter during lifting operations on a construction project. We looked at some of the reasons why unexpected load movement may occur, and we discussed how this is most likely to occur at the start of a lift. There are, of course, more causes of unexpected load movement relevant to the environment you work in and the types of lifts you do. The key principle, however, is that lifting personnel must assess their surroundings before starting and undertaking a lift. Once the hazards present have been identified and assessed, lifting personnel are able to identify the safe spaces to be during the lift. Before picking up the load, personnel should take their hands off the load, step away, and move to a safe space. If there is a problem during the lift must be stopped. Personnel must not approach the load until it is steady, stable, and safe to do so. We hope you are able to use the principles shown in this film to raise the safety standards of the lifting operations you are involved in. Produced with thanks and the support of the Industry Lifting Lead AP Group, which brings together contractors, suppliers, regulators, and associations for the continued raising of standards in the lifting sector. Hands off, step away, safe space.